There is a mountain ridge in the Peruvian Andes, 2,430 meters above sea level, where the cloud forest meets the granite peaks and the Urubamba River makes a great horseshoe bend in the valley far below that contains one of the most extraordinary things human beings have ever built. Temples cut from granite blocks so precisely fitted that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Terraces cascading down the mountain slopes in great agricultural steps that turned a near-vertical Andean peak into farmland capable of feeding a city. A sundial carved from a single piece of stone, the Intihuatana, the hitching post of the sun, that the Inca astronomers used to track the movements of the celestial bodies with an accuracy that still astonishes modern astronomers. Fountains connected by a hydraulic system so sophisticated that water flowed through channels carved in living rock from a spring 2 kilometers away, arriving at the city in a series of 16 cascading fountains that provided fresh water to every part of the settlement regardless of rainfall. All of it hidden. For 400 years. In the middle of one of the most biologically rich and most physically dramatic landscapes on Earth. Known to every community in the surrounding valleys. Invisible to the outside world. The story of Machu Picchu, of who built it, and why, and what happened to it, and how it was lost to the wider world for 4 centuries, and how it was found again, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of human civilization. It is a story about the Inca Empire at the absolute peak of its power and sophistication. It is a story about the Spanish conquest that destroyed that empire with a speed and a completeness that still staggers the historical imagination. It is a story about the specific way that colonization erases knowledge, not always through deliberate destruction but sometimes simply through the replacement of one knowledge system with another that has no interest in what the first system knew. And it is a story about a Yale professor from Connecticut who climbed a mountain in 1911 following directions from a local farmer boy and found something that changed what the world understood about the possibilities of pre-Columbian American civilization. But before any of that, before the Spanish and the conquest and the 4 centuries of cloud forest reclaiming the stone, before Hiram Bingham and his camera and his Yale expedition and the National Geographic magazine photographs that introduced Machu Picchu to the world, before all of it, there was the Inca Empire. And the Inca Empire was one of the most remarkable political and organizational achievements in the entire history of human civilization. The Inca, Tawantinsuyu in Quechua, the language of the Inca state, meaning the 4 regions together, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America and the largest empire in the world at the time of its contact with Europeans. At its peak in the early 16th century, it stretched approximately 4,000 kilometers from the northern border of modern Ecuador to the southern reaches of modern Chile and Argentina, encompassing the entire Andean mountain chain, the Pacific coastal desert, the high-altitude grasslands of the Altiplano, and the margins of the Amazon basin. It governed somewhere between 6 and 12 million people, the estimates vary widely, through a system of administrative sophistication that included a road network of approximately 40,000 kilometers of paved highways connecting the empire's farthest reaches, a system of relay runners, the chasquis, who could carry a message from Cusco to Quito in approximately 5 days, and a complex system of knotted cords called quipu that functioned as an administrative recording system, encoding population counts and tribute records and historical narratives in a medium that modern scholars are still in the process of fully deciphering. The Inca built without the wheel. They built without iron tools, using stone and bronze and the specific hardness of one type of stone ground against another to shape the granite blocks that formed their most important structures. They built without mortar, the specific technique of fitting stone blocks together with such precision that the weight and the geometry of the stones themselves provided the structural stability, a technique so effective that Inca stonework has survived 5 centuries of Andean earthquakes that have repeatedly damaged or destroyed the Spanish colonial buildings constructed on top of Inca foundations. They built in one of the most seismically active and topographically challenging environments on Earth. The Andes are geologically young mountains, still rising, producing the specific combination of earthquake risk and extreme altitude and unpredictable weather that makes construction in the Andean world a permanent negotiation with the forces of geological instability. The 9th Sapa Inca, the supreme ruler of Tawantinsuyu, was Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, who came to power in approximately 1438 in circumstances of dynastic drama involving the defense of Cusco against the Chanca Confederation and the transformation of what had been a relatively modest regional kingdom in the Cusco Valley into the continental empire that would eventually stretch from Ecuador to Chile. Pachacuti, whose name means earth shaker or he who transforms the world, and whose historical legacy fully justifies both translations, was the ruler who designed and built Machu Picchu. The archaeological and historical evidence for this attribution has accumulated sufficiently in recent decades that the scholarly consensus now places the construction of Machu Picchu firmly in the reign of Pachacuti in the mid to late 15th century, approximately between 1450 and 1470. Why was Machu Picchu built? This is the question that has generated more scholarly debate and more popular speculation than any other aspect of the site, and the answer, insofar as there is one that the current state of archaeological knowledge supports, is that Machu Picchu was a royal estate of Pachacuti, a palace complex and ritual center for the personal use of the Inca ruler and the Panaca, the royal lineage group, that was associated with his name and memory after his death. The Inca had a specific institution, the concept of the split inheritance, in which a deceased Sapa Inca's mummy was maintained as a living presence at his estate, attended by his descendants, consulted on matters of state, and served with food and drink in the ongoing fiction of his continued presence. The estate itself, the palace complex where the ruler had lived and where his mummy would be maintained after death, remained the property of his descendants in perpetuity, generating the specific problem that each new Sapa Inca had to build his own estate rather than inheriting his predecessors, because the predecessor's estate was permanently occupied by the predecessor's mummy and the predecessor's descendants. This institution of split inheritance was the engine that drove the construction of the great Inca royal estates, including Machu Picchu, in the century before the Spanish conquest. The location chosen for Pachacuti's estate was one of the most dramatically beautiful in the entire Andean world, the ridge between the peaks of Machu Picchu and Huayna Picchu, rising above the great horseshoe bend of the Urubamba River in the sacred valley of the Inca, approximately 80 kilometers northwest of Cusco. The location was not chosen for convenience or accessibility. The ridge is steep-sided, difficult to approach, and requires significant effort to reach from the valley below. It was chosen for the specific Andean aesthetic that placed supreme value on the relationship between human construction and the sacred landscape of mountains, rivers, and sky that surrounded it. The mountains visible from the site were themselves objects of religious veneration. The river below was sacred. The position of the ridge relative to the sun and the stars was astronomically significant in ways that the Inca architects had calculated with great care. The construction of Machu Picchu was an achievement of organizational genius as much as architectural genius. The granite from which the buildings were constructed was quarried directly on the site. There is a quarry visible at the northeastern end of the site where unfinished blocks still lie in various stages of preparation, giving archaeologists a direct window into the construction process. The blocks were shaped using harder stones as tools, the specific abrasion technique that the Inca used to achieve the precision fit of their stonework requiring enormous patience and skill. They were moved using the combination of human labor, ropes, earthen ramps, and the specific leverage techniques that Inca engineering had developed for moving large stones in mountain terrain without wheeled vehicles. The workforce that built Machu Picchu was organized through the MITA, the Inca system of labor taxation, in which communities across the empire owed periodic labor service to the state rather than tribute in goods. The MITA workers who built Machu Picchu came from communities across Tawantinsuyu. Some of the skeletal remains found at the site show isotopic signatures from coastal and lowland regions, indicating that at least some of the population came from far outside the Andean highlands. They were fed from the agricultural terraces that were among the first parts of the site to be constructed. The terrace system that converted the steep mountain slopes into farmland capable of supporting the construction workforce and the eventual resident population was built before the ceremonial and residential buildings it was designed to feed. The permanent population of Machu Picchu at its operational peak was probably relatively small. Estimates range from 500 to 1,000 permanent residents, supplemented by the seasonal presence of Pachacuti and his court during the visits that the royal estate function required, and by the priests and ritual specialists who maintained the huacas, the sacred objects and sacred locations. that the site's religious functions demanded. The population was not primarily agricultural. The terraces produced food but not in quantities sufficient for a large resident population, but rather a combination of religious specialists, administrators, craftspeople, and the aklas, the chosen women who were selected across the empire for their beauty and skill and who served in the most important Inca religious and royal establishments weaving textiles and brewing chicha, the sacred maize beer that was the ritual drink of Inca ceremony. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire, which began with Francisco Pizarro's arrival on the Peruvian coast in 1532 and which achieved the effective destruction of Inca political independence within a few years through a combination of military force, epidemic disease, and the specific political exploitation of the civil war that had weakened the empire before the Spanish arrival, is one of the most rapid and most complete destructions of a major civilization in human history. The Inca Empire that had governed 4,000 kilometers of the Andean world was effectively dismantled within a generation. The administrative system, the religious establishment, the road network, the system of storehouses and redistribution that had fed and governed millions of people, all of it was destroyed or transformed or simply ceased to function in the chaos of the conquest and its aftermath. Machu Picchu was not attacked by the Spanish. It was not burned. It was not looted, or rather, if it was looted, it was not comprehensively looted in the way that Cusco and the great Inca temples were stripped of their gold and silver. The Spanish simply never found it. The site does not appear in any Spanish colonial document, no mention of the location, no record of a visit, no administrative notation of the existence of an Inca royal estate in the mountains above the Urubamba. The cloud forest that reclaimed the terraces and the buildings within decades of the site's abandonment made it invisible from the river valley below and from the ridges around it. Why was it abandoned? The most likely explanation, consistent with the historical evidence for the Inca royal estate system, is that the death of Pachacuti and the subsequent deaths of the members of his panarca in the epidemic diseases that accompanied the Spanish conquest, combined with the complete collapse of the Inca state that had maintained the site and supplied its population, made continued occupation impossible. The people who knew Machu Picchu were still there, in the communities of the Urubamba Valley and the surrounding highlands, but the state apparatus that had given the site its function and its population had ceased to exist. Without the Sapa Inca to visit his estate, without the MITA labor to maintain the terraces, without the administrative system to supply the resident population, the site simply emptied. The forest grew back. And the world beyond the Urubamba Valley forgot that it had ever existed. The local communities never forgot. This is one of the most important and most frequently underemphasized facts in the entire story of Machu Picchu. The families who farmed the lower slopes of the mountain, the communities of the Sacred Valley, the descendants of the Inca laborers who had built the site and the Inca subjects who had supplied it, they knew the ruins were there. The ridge above the bend of the Urubamba had a name in Quechua that described its geography with the precision of people who had been looking at it for generations. Machu Picchu means Old Mountain in Quechua. The name was not invented by archaeologists. It was already there, already in use by the communities of the valley, when Hiram Bingham arrived in 1911. Hiram Bingham III was a Yale lecturer in Latin American history in 1911, not yet the famous archaeologist he would become, not yet the model for the fictional adventurer that popular culture would eventually construct from his image, but an ambitious academic in his mid-30s who had become fascinated by the Inca and by the possibility that the last Inca strongholds, the places where the Inca resistance to Spanish rule had held out for decades after the conquest, might still be findable. In the mountains of southern Peru. He was looking for Vilcabamba, the last capital of the Inca resistance, the place where the last Sapa Inca Tupac Amaru had been captured by the Spanish in 1572 and taken to Cusco for execution, ending the last formal resistance to colonial rule. He was not primarily looking for Machu Picchu. He was looking for Vilcabamba, and Machu Picchu appeared in his path, as the locals had always known it was there, because he asked the right questions of the right people. The right people, in this case, were the farmers of the Urubamba Valley. Bingham had been told by local officials that there were ruins in the mountains above the river, and he had hired a local guide, Melchor Arteaga, to show him what was there. On July 24, 1911, Bingham climbed the steep trail up the mountain from the valley floor, through dense cloud forest, in the thin cold air of the Andean morning, guided by Arteaga and led for the final section by a local farmer boy named Pablito Alvarez, approximately 10 to 11 years old, who knew the ruins because his family had been farming the lower terraces. The boy led him out of the forest onto the terraces. And Bingham saw Machu Picchu for the first time. His account of the moment, published in National Geographic magazine in 1913 and in his book Inca Land and later in the more famous Lost City of the Incas, captures something of the specific quality of the experience, though his language is the language of a Yale academic of 1911 and needs some translation for a modern reader. What he saw, what anyone sees, emerging from the cloud forest onto the terraces of Machu Picchu for the first time, is something for which the standard vocabulary of archaeological description is genuinely inadequate. The Intihuatana. The Temple of the Sun, its curved wall of perfectly fitted stone built around a natural granite outcrop so that the rising sun of the June solstice shines directly through its window onto a specific point on the floor. The room of the three windows, its trapezoidal windows framing the mountain Huayna Picchu across the valley in a composition that looks like it was designed by an architect who understood photography 4 centuries before photography was invented. The agricultural terraces descending the mountain on all sides in great green steps, still partially visible beneath the centuries of encroaching vegetation. The granite peaks of the surrounding mountains, Huayna Picchu, Puchucusay, the mountains whose names the Quechua-speaking communities of the valley had been using for generations, rising above the ridge in the specific dramatic composition that Inca architects had chosen this location to frame. Bingham photographed everything. He returned the following year with a full Yale National Geographic expedition, cleared the vegetation from the terraces and the buildings, conducted excavations that recovered skeletal remains and artifacts, and produced the documentation that introduced Machu Picchu to the world outside Peru. The National Geographic photographs, reproduced in a 1913 issue of the magazine that was the most detailed exploration of a single subject the publication had ever produced, made Machu Picchu immediately famous in the English-speaking world and eventually famous everywhere. The subsequent history of Machu Picchu, the decades of increasing archaeological understanding, the growing recognition of its significance in Peruvian national identity, the development of tourism that has made it the most visited site in South America, the ongoing scholarly debates about its function and its population and its history, is itself a substantial story. The artifacts and skeletal remains that Bingham removed to Yale University became the subject of a decades-long dispute between Yale and the Peruvian government that was eventually resolved in 2012, when Yale returned the collections to Peru, where they are now housed in a museum in Cusco. The site was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1983. It was named one of the new 7 Wonders of the World in 2007. A popular vote whose methodology is contested by serious archaeologists, but whose outcome reflected a genuine global recognition of the site's extraordinary quality. Approximately 1.5 million people visit it every year, a number that the Peruvian government has been working to manage through ticketing systems and visitor limits, trying to balance the economic importance of tourism with the conservation needs of a site whose stonework has been surviving for 5 centuries and whose survival for the next 5 centuries requires careful management of the human pressure on it. The clouds that give the cloud forest its name move through the site constantly, rolling in from the Amazon basin to the east, covering the ruins in a white mist that reduces visibility to meters before lifting to reveal the mountains in the sharp clarity of the Andean sky. The mist and the revelation happen multiple times in a single day. In the specific quality of the light, the way the Andean sun, when it appears between clouds at this altitude, illuminates the granite with a warmth and a precision that the lower altitudes do not produce, Machu Picchu looks, in the best light, exactly like what it was built to be. A royal estate of the most powerful ruler in the pre-Columbian Americas. A ritual center connecting the human and the divine in the specific Andean theology that saw mountains and rivers and the sun and the stars as sacred presences requiring acknowledgement and propitiation. A place built at the intersection of earth and sky, on a ridge between peaks and above a river, where the geometry of the landscape and the geometry of the buildings and the geometry of the heavens all converge in a composition whose beauty is not accidental. Pachacutic's architects knew exactly what they were doing. 5.5 centuries later, the evidence of what they knew is still there, in the fitted stones and the cascading fountains and the Intihuatana and the view from the Temple of the Sun at dawn on the June solstice. Still there. Above the clouds. Above the river. above 500 years of history, waiting, as it has always waited, for anyone willing to climb the mountain.